Any empire, no matter how strong it is, sooner or later will collapse. The history of any empire is like a person's life path: birth, prosperity, and death. Throughout the history of mankind, there have been many empires, some of which have left their mark on history, while others have sunk into oblivion. Here are the 10 largest empires of the past that we will talk about today. Enjoy watching. Number 10. Roman Empire. One of the oldest empires, whose existence influenced almost the entire European civilization, was the ancient Rome. Rome had begun expanding shortly after the founding of the Republic in the 6th century BC. As a polity, it included large territorial holdings around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia ruled by emperors. From the accession of Caesar Augustus as the first Roman emperor to the military anarchy of the 3rd century, it was a principate with Italy as the metropole of its provinces and the city of Rome as its sole capital. Later, the empire was ruled by multiple emperors who shared control over the Western Roman Empire and over the Eastern Roman Empire. Due to the Roman Empire's vast extent and long endurance, the institutions and culture of Rome had a profound and lasting influence on the development of language, religion, art, architecture, literature, philosophy, law, and forms of government in the territory it governed, and far beyond. Number 9. Macedonian Empire. Alexander the Great spent most of his ruling years conducting a lengthy military campaign throughout Western Asia and Northeastern Africa. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered to be one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders. However, his empire was not destined to exist for a long time. Without leaving a legitimate heir, his military leaders began a struggle for power, during which the conquered lands were lost. Alexander's legacy extended beyond his military conquests, and his reign marked a turning point in European and Asian history. His campaigns greatly increased contacts and trade between East and West, and vast areas to the east were significantly exposed to Greek civilization and influence. Some of the cities he founded became major cultural centers, many surviving into the 21st century. Number 8. Japanese Empire. At the end of the 19th century, Japan underwent a period of industrialization and militarization of the country. The Meiji Restoration, being the fastest modernization of any country to date, all of these aspects contributed to Japan's emergence as a great power and the establishment of a colonial empire. Following the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I, economic and political turmoil in the 1920s, including the Great Depression, led to the rise of militarism, nationalism, and totalitarianism, as embodied in the Showa statism ideology, eventually culminating in Japan's membership in the Axis alliance and the conquest of a large part of the Asia-Pacific in World War II. Japan's armed forces initially achieved large-scale military successes during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. However, starting from 1942, particularly after the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan was forced to adopt a defensive stance, and the American island-hopping campaign meant that Japan was slowly losing all of the territory it had gained. The US forces had planned an invasion, but Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the nearly simultaneous Soviet declaration of war on August 9, 1945, and subsequent invasion of Manchuria and other territories. A period of occupation by the Allies followed. In 1947, with American involvement, a new constitution was enacted, officially bringing the Empire of Japan to an end, and Japan's imperial army was replaced with the Japan Self-Defense Forces. Occupation and reconstruction continued until 1952, eventually forming the current constitutional monarchy known as Japan. Number 7. Abbasid Caliphate. The early Muslim conquests began with the Islamic prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. He established a new unified polity in the Arabian Peninsula, which under the subsequent Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates saw a century of rapid expansion. The resulting empire stretched from parts of Central Asia and South Asia, across the Middle East, North Africa, the Caucasus, and parts of Southwest Europe. The Muslim conquests brought about the collapse of the Sassanid Empire and a great territorial loss for the Byzantine Empire. The reasons for the Muslim success were formation of a state in the Arabian Peninsula, and ideological coherence and mobilization was a primary reason why the Muslim armies in the space of 100 years were able to establish one of the largest pre-modern empires until that time. Estimates of the total area of the combined territory held by the Islamic Caliphate at its peak have been as high as 13 million square kilometers, or 5 million square miles. Most historians agree as well that the Sassanid Persian and Byzantine Roman empires were militarily and economically exhausted from decades of fighting one another, which allowed the Muslims to seize their lands without much problem. Number 6. Second French Empire. After defeat in Napoleonic Wars and several revolutions that crossed the country, the new France became the 18-year imperial Bonapartist regime of Napoleon III. From 1852 to 1870, between the Second and the Third Republic of France, the greatest achievements included a grand railway network that facilitated commerce and tied the nation together with Paris as its hub. This stimulated economic growth and brought prosperity to most regions of the country. In international policy, Napoleon III tried to emulate his uncle Napoleon I, engaging in numerous imperial ventures around the world, as well as several wars in Europe. He began his reign with French victories in Crimea and in Italy, gaining Savoy and Nice. Using very harsh methods, he built up the French Empire in North Africa and in Southeast Asia. Napoleon III also sought to erect a second Mexican empire and bring it into the French orbit, but this ended in a fiasco. He badly mishandled the threat from Prussia, and by the end of his reign, the French emperor found himself without allies in the face of overwhelming German force. His rule was ended during the Franco-Prussian War, when he was captured by the Prussian army at Sedan in 1870 and dethroned by French Republicans. He later died in exile in 1873, living in the United Kingdom. Together with him, the Second French Empire collapsed. Number 5. Qing Empire. The Qing dynasty was the Manchu-led last dynasty in the imperial history of China. It was proclaimed in 1636 in Manchuria, in 1644 entered Beijing, extended its rule to cover all of China proper, and then extended the empire into Central Asia. The dynasty lasted until 1912. The multi-ethnic Qing Empire lasted for almost 3 centuries and assembled the territorial base for modern China. It was the largest Chinese dynasty, and in 1790, the 4th largest empire in world history in terms of territorial size. With a population of 432 million in 1912, it was the world's most populous country at the time. The height of Qing glory and power was reached in the reign of the Qianlong Emperor in 19th century. He led 10 great campaigns that extended Qing control into Inner Asia and personally supervised Confucian cultural projects. After his death, the dynasty faced changes in the world system, foreign intrusion, internal revolts, population growth, economic disruption, official corruption, and the reluctance of Confucian elites to change their mindsets. Number 4. Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire during the early modern period was a colonial empire governed by Spain and its predecessor states between 1492 and 1976. One of the largest empires in history, it was, in conjunction with the Portuguese, the first to usher the European age of discovery and achieve a global scale, controlling vast portions of the Americas, the archipelago of the Philippines, various islands in the Pacific and territories in Western Europe and Africa. It was one of the world's most powerful empires of the early modern period, becoming known as the empire on which the sun never sets, and reached its maximum extent in the 18th century. Number 3. Russian Empire. The Russian Empire extended across Eurasia from 1721, succeeding the Tsardom of Russia following the Treaty of Nystad that ended the Great Northern War. The rise of the Russian Empire coincided with the decline of neighboring rival powers, the Swedish Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and King China. The empire lasted until the Republic was proclaimed by the provisional government that took power after the February Revolution of 1917. The third largest empire in history, at one point stretching over 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and North America, with 125.6 million subjects according to the 1897 census. It had the third largest population in the world at the time after King China and India. Like all empires, it featured great economic, ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. Number 2. Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire emerged from the unification of several nomadic tribes in the Mongol homeland, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, whom a council proclaimed as the ruler of all Mongols in 1206. The empire grew rapidly under his rule and that of his descendants, who sent out invading armies in every direction. The vast transcontinental empire connected the east with the west and the Pacific to the Mediterranean, in an enforced Pax Mongolica, allowing the dissemination and exchange of trade, technologies, commodities, and ideologies across Eurasia. The Mongol Empire of the 13th and 14th centuries was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Number 1. British Empire. and the biggest empire that ever existed in history was the British Empire. The British Empire was composed of the dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates, and other territories ruled or administered by the United Kingdom and its predecessor states. It began with the overseas possessions and trading posts established by England between the late 16th and early 18th centuries. At its height, it was the largest empire in history and, for over a century, was the foremost global power. By 1913, the British Empire held sway over 412 million people, 23% of the world population at the time, and by 1920, it covered 35,500,000 square kilometers, 24% of the Earth's total land area. As a result, its constitutional, legal, linguistic, and cultural legacy is widespread. At the peak of its power, it was described as the empire on which the sun never sets, as the sun was always shining on at least one of its territories. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this video. Leave your comments, subscribe, and see you later. Goodbye.